The men who ran the eastern waterfront feared very few things, but somehow they feared missing dinner. That was the part that confused Dorian Ashby most. He had built his empire on fear, on silence, on consequence, on the particular stillness that fell over a room when he walked into it. He had 43 men on payroll who would have walked into traffic for him. He had rivals who didn't sleep easy. He had a reputation that had taken 15 years and considerable suffering to construct. And yet, on a Thursday evening in late October, he had stood outside the kitchen of his own estate and watched 3 of his most dangerous lieutenants lined up in the hallway. Grown men, armed men, men who had broken bones and kept secrets, waiting quietly, like children outside a school cafeteria, waiting for her. He hadn't known what to make of it then. He still wasn't sure he did now. Her name was Cecilia Vane, 28 years old. Hired 8 months ago as a bookkeeper for Ashby Holdings, the legitimate face of everything Dorian owned. She had come with solid references, a university degree from Dalhousie, and the kind of quiet precision that made auditors comfortable and everyone else forget she was in the room. That was probably intentional. Dorian had hired her himself, which was unusual. He didn't typically concern himself with accounting staff. But the previous bookkeeper had been skimming, and Dorian had made the decision that the next person to handle his numbers would be someone he chose with his own eyes. He had interviewed 6 candidates. Cecilia had been the 4th. She had walked in wearing a dark blazer, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her hands folded on the table. She was round-faced and soft-shouldered, the kind of woman who took up space apologetically, as though she expected someone to ask her to take up less. She had answered every question directly, without embellishment, without the particular kind of performance that people sometimes put on when they wanted to impress him. When he had asked her if she knew who he was, what the company actually was, she had been quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she had said, "Yes, that's why I'm asking for 15% above your listed salary." The risk differential is standard. He had hired her that afternoon. She worked quietly. She produced clean numbers. She came in early, stayed late, and never asked questions that weren't relevant to the work. She sat at a corner desk in the accounts office on the 3rd floor, surrounded by files, a thermos of tea always at her elbow. She was very good at her job. Dorian had barely noticed her for the first 6 months. The night it started, the night he would later trace everything back to, was a Wednesday in February, the middle of a Canadian winter, that had decided not to apologize for itself. There had been a meeting that ran long, a disagreement among the lieutenants that required his personal attention, and by the time the conference room cleared out, it was past 11, and most of the household staff had gone home. The estate ran a rotating security staff of 12. They worked overnight in pairs. That night, 2 of them, a man named Quill and a younger one everyone called Sutter, had been on the east corridor when they heard sounds from the kitchen. Not alarming sounds, chopping sounds, the low hiss of something hitting a hot pan. They had investigated hands-on weapons and found Cecilia Vane standing at the large kitchen island in her work clothes, her blazer draped over a chair, making soup. She looked up when they came in. Her expression didn't change. "I got hungry," she said simply. "There's nothing in the break room. I didn't think anyone would mind." They had told her awkwardly that she wasn't supposed to be in that part of the house after hours. She had nodded, turned off the burner, and begun to clean up. Then Quill had said, without quite meaning to, "What kind of soup was that?" She had paused, looked at him, then looked at the pot. "Potato leek," she said. "My grandmother's recipe. You want some?" He should have said no. He said yes. By the time Sutter came back from his perimeter check, Quill was sitting at the kitchen island eating soup and looking like a man who had not had a home-cooked meal in some time, which was accurate. Sutter stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he sat down too. Cecilia ate standing at the counter, her thermos of tea replaced by a bowl of her own soup. quiet and unassuming as ever. When she left that night, she told them the leftover soup was in the fridge. She labeled the container with the date and a small note. Reheat gently, don't boil. The next Wednesday, she came back. Nobody told Dorian. There was no particular reason to. A bookkeeper making soup in the kitchen after hours was not the kind of thing that required his attention. The security staff told the household manager, who shrugged and said she wasn't doing any harm. The household manager told nobody else. What nobody quite anticipated was that the Wednesdays would continue, or that they would grow. By April, Cecilia was coming in 2 evenings a week. She had learned, through the particular social osmosis of people who work in close quarters with each other, which of the overnight staff had dietary restrictions, who was from the East Coast and missed seafood, who was keeping halal, who had a dairy intolerance they were too embarrassed to mention. She kept a small notebook. She adapted accordingly. She wasn't running a catering operation. She was just cooking. The distinction was subtle, but the men felt it. There was no performance to it, no announcement, no expectation of gratitude. She simply arrived, cooked, portioned things out, labeled everything clearly, and left. The kitchen was always cleaner when she was done than when she had arrived. The men talked about it among themselves the way they talked about things that mattered, but that they hadn't quite found words for. Quill told his partner Reston that the shepherd's pie she'd made tasted exactly like the one his mother used to make, and then looked embarrassed about having said it. Sutter mentioned, offhandedly, that she had remembered he'd said something once about liking anything with smoked paprika, and that she had started incorporating it. She had remembered. That was the part that kept coming up. She remembered these were men who were invisible as a professional requirement. They stood in hallways and corridors and were looked through by the people they protected. No one remembered what they liked. No one asked, she remembered. Dorian found out in May. He had been awake at 2 in the morning. Insomnia was an old companion, and had gone downstairs for coffee. The kitchen light was on. He stopped in the doorway of the hall and listened, and heard the particular sound of someone comfortable in a kitchen, the unhurried movement of someone who knew where everything was. He walked in. Cecilia was standing at the stove, her back to him, stirring something that smelled like rosemary and slow-cooked meat. Her hair was down, which he hadn't seen before. She was wearing a university sweatshirt over her work trousers, and she was humming something very quietly, half under her breath. The way people hum when they think they're completely alone. She stopped when she heard him, turned around. For a fraction of a second, her expression was entirely unguarded, startled, and then immediately composed. "Mr. Ashby," she said. Her voice was steady. He looked at her, then at the stove, then back at her. "It's 2 in the morning," he said. "I know." She turned back to the pot. "The overnight staff rotation ends at 3. I wanted to have everything ready before Quill's shift finishes. He mentioned his knee has been bad. I thought something warm would help." Dorian stood in the doorway for another moment. "You're making food," he said. "For the security staff?" "Yes." "At 2 in the morning. The timing is practical," she said. "They can't exactly leave for a meal." He should have said something appropriate to the situation, something that clarified who ran the estate and what the appropriate relationship was between the bookkeeping staff and the people who worked the overnight security rotation. He was aware of this. Instead, he said, "What is that?" "Lamb stew," she said. "Slow cooked. It's better the longer it sits. Do you want some?" He sat down at the island. She served him without comment, set a spoon and a folded paper towel in front of him, and turned back to the stove to continue stirring. She didn't look at him with the careful attention people usually gave him when he was in the room. She wasn't performing calm. The stew was actually calm. The stew was extraordinary. He ate the whole bowl and did necessarily. She didn't fill the silence unnecessarily. When the timer she'd set on her phone went off, she turned off the burner, covered the pot, wrote a note on a sticky pad. Lamb stew, wheat-free, ready to serve, reheat low and slow, and affixed it to the lid. "You know who can eat what," he said. It wasn't a question. "I pay attention," she said simply. She folded a dish towel, set it on the rack, picked up her blazer from the chair, and said goodnight. He sat at the island for a while after she left, the empty bowl in front of him, thinking. There was a woman named Portia Hale who ran the estate's domestic operations. Household management, staff coordination, the daily logistics of maintaining a property of that size. She had worked for Dorian for 6 years. She was efficient and thorough, and she had a particular gift for the kind of social architecture that kept large households running smoothly. She had also taken an immediate and comprehensive dislike to Cecilia Vane. It wasn't personal, Portia would have said if asked. It was structural. The girl was overstepping. She had no business in that kitchen. She had no business making herself known to the security staff, building little loyalties, making herself, and here was the word Portia kept returning to. Indispensable. It was a strategy. It had to be. Portia had been the unspoken heart of the household for 6 years. The staff came to her. The logistics flowed through her. And now they were asking Cecilia. In June, Portia went to Dorian. She kept it professional. She outlined a series of concerns, that it was inappropriate for accounting staff to have unrestricted access to estate common areas after hours, that the kitchen was a managed space, that the practice of staff accepting home-prepared food from a colleague created an informal hierarchy. She used words like liability and fomentors, maxit, and professional boundaries and precedent. Dorian listened without expression, which was his default. When she was finished, he said, "Has anything gone wrong?" Portia adjusted her position. "Not specifically, no. Has any member of staff complained? No, but has the kitchen been left in a state, or has anyone's work performance been affected?" "No," Portia admitted. "But that's somewhat beside the—" "Then I don't see the problem," Dorian said. Portia held herself very straight. "Mr. Ashby, I'm simply trying to ensure that—" "I understand what you're trying to ensure," he said. His voice hadn't changed, but something in the room had, and I appreciate your thoroughness. But Cecilia Vane is not accountable to household management. She's accountable to me. He let that sit for a moment. Is there anything else? There wasn't. What Dorian didn't say to Portia, what he hadn't said to anyone, was that he had started going to the kitchen on the nights he knew Cecilia would be there. He hadn't planned it. The first time had been circumstantial. Genuine insomnia, genuine hunger. The second time was less so. By the third, he was not in the habit of lying to himself, and he acknowledged privately that he was going because he wanted to. She was, quite simply, the most restful person he had ever been around. It wasn't passivity. She wasn't quiet in the way some people were quiet, waiting, calculating, watching for an angle. She was quiet the way a kitchen is quiet when something good is cooking. There was a completeness to it. She occupied herself entirely with what she was doing, and when she spoke, she said something worth saying. He found himself talking to her in the way he hadn't talked to anyone in a very long time, not performing, not managing, not calculating the effect of each sentence. She listened without the kind of deference that made honest conversation impossible. When she disagreed with something, he said, she said so, plainly, without making a production of it. He had said something, once in passing, about how the security staff were essentially interchangeable. A unit, not individuals. She had looked at him with an expression that was not quite a frown. "Quill has a daughter starting university next year," she said. "He's been working double shifts since January to cover the tuition. Sut sends half his pay to his mother in Moncton. Reyes hasn't taken a sick day in 2 years because he can't afford to lose the hours." She stirred the pot. "They're not interchangeable." He had thought about that for a long time afterward. The dinner happened in mid-September, and it was not something anyone had planned. There was a meeting at the estate, the kind of meeting that took up a full day and left everyone edged and exhausted. 6 men from 3 different operations, a contractual disagreement that had been festering for months, the usual negotiation conducted in the particular language of men who did not trust each other and had very good reasons not to. By 7 in the evening, the meeting was still going. The catering that had been arranged for the afternoon had run out. People were hungry, and the hunger was making the room worse. Someone, later, no one could remember who, mentioned that there was a possibility of food, that there was someone in the estate who sometimes cooked. One of the men, a senior figure from a Montreal operation named Gauthier, said with a certain dismissiveness that they didn't have time for someone's hobby cooking. The room went quiet in a way that the people who worked for Dorian recognized immediately. Her name, Dorian said, in a tone so moderate it was almost polite, is Miss Vane, and she is not a hobby. He got up from the table, left the room, and was back 20 minutes later. He had spoken to Cecilia himself. The dinner would be an hour. What arrived was not what anyone in that room had expected. Gauthier had been envisioning something improvised, something that announced its own limitations. What came out of the Ashby kitchen 90 minutes later, because she had needed 90, and Dorian had told them to wait, was a proper dinner, a Quebec-style tourtière, because she had looked at the guest list and noted the Montreal connection. Roasted root vegetables, a salad dressed with something that made Gauthier stop mid-conversation and look at his plate. Warm bread, a lentil dish on the side because she had somehow found out that one of the men kept a particular diet. She served it herself, which no one had expected. She came in quietly, set everything down, explained briefly and without performance what each dish was. When she turned to leave, Gauthier, who was the kind of man who acknowledged very few people, said, "Where did you learn to cook like that?" She looked at him with her even, attentive eyes. "My grandmother," she said, "and paying attention." She left. The negotiations finished by 10 that evening. An agreement was reached that had been stalled for 4 months. No one said it was because of the dinner. But the temperature in the room had changed after the meal, and everyone who had been there knew it. October brought the first frost and a problem Dorian hadn't anticipated. Portia Hale resigned. She sent a formal letter, professional in tone, 2 weeks' notice, no elaboration. Dorian accepted it without comment. He spent a day reviewing the household operations she managed, and realized to which things ran smoothly that the degree to which her systems had more to do with her systems than he had fully appreciated. He had a conversation with Cecilia about it, not asking her to take it on that hadn't occurred to him yet. He was simply thinking out loud, which was something he had begun doing with her. She listened. She asked a few questions about the specific areas of responsibility. Then she said, "The staff already know how things work. The issue isn't management. It's communication. Someone just needs to keep track of what everyone needs and make sure the information flows." "You're describing yourself," he said. She looked at him steadily. "No, Sadim, I'm describing what's needed. Whether that's me, a separate question." It wasn't a separate question. He knew that. She knew that. They both let it sit. The following Monday, she moved her desk to the ground floor. She kept the bookkeeping work. She took on the coordination as well, without title change, without salary renegotiation at her instigation, though Dorian raised her salary regardless, because he was not a man who expected something for nothing. The household ran better within a week. Not dramatically, just the particular smoothness that happens when information stops falling between cracks. The night Dorian understood something he hadn't let himself understand before was a Tuesday in November. He had come back from a meeting across the city. A difficult one. The kind that ended with everything technically resolved and nothing actually settled. He came through the door at 9:30. The house was quiet. He found her in the kitchen. She was not cooking. She was sitting at the island with a mug of tea and a book, her reading glasses on, her shoes off. She looked up when he came in, took one look at his face. She didn't ask what happened. She got up, put the kettle on, and made him tea. She set it in front of him and sat back down, picked up her book again. He sat there for a while, not talking. She read. The kettle had been loud, and then the kitchen was quiet, and the tea was hot, and the light above the island was the warm kind, not the overhead fluorescent that the rest of the estate ran on. She had replaced that bulb months ago, and he had only just noticed. "You changed the light," he said. She turned a page. "Including you. Though I don't think you noticed." He looked at her for a long moment. She was still reading. Her hair was down again, the way it was in the late evenings. She had a small scar on her left hand that he'd never asked about. Her tea mug said Halifax on it in worn letters, and he realized she'd brought it from home and had been using it for months. He had never noticed. He had spent 15 years being the most attentive man in every room he entered, because in his line of work, inattention had consequences, and he had spent months not noticing the woman who had quietly, without fanfare or agenda, made his house into something that felt like a home. "Cecilia," he said. She looked up. He didn't have a sentence ready. He hadn't planned this. He said, "I would like you to stay." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not planning to leave," she said. "That's not what I mean." She looked at him over the top of her glasses. He had the experience, rare for him, of feeling somewhat exposed, not threatened, just seen in a way he didn't quite have a protocol for. "I know what you mean," she said. "I'm thinking about it," he said. She went back to her book. He drank his tea. The kitchen was quiet in the way it had learned to be around both of them, not empty, just settled. She said yes 2 weeks later, in the kitchen, unprompted, in the middle of making breakfast, without looking up from the pan. Just said it as though it were the next natural sentence in a conversation they'd been having for months. Because, he supposed, it was. Word moved through the estate the way word always moved, not through any official announcement, but through the particular attention that people pay when something that has always been implicitly true is finally explicitly confirmed. The reaction was not what Dorian had expected, though he should have. On a Friday evening in late November, he called a dinner at the estate. The people who ran his operations, the men and women who reported to him, who had built the enterprise with him over 15 years, came to the table. It was a standard operational dinner, the kind he held periodically. Cecilia cooked, because that was what she did, and because she had refused to let anyone cater it. She made a menu that Dorian later realized she had constructed with the same attention she brought to everything. Each dish specific to someone at the table, a regional comfort from someone's background, a nod to a preference she had observed, a small private acknowledgement folded into something as ordinary as food. Nobody said anything at first. Then Gauthier, who had been at the September meeting, looked down the table and said, with the particular rough warmth of a man who is not naturally expressive, "The tourtière is exactly right." It was, by any standard, an understated thing to say. But the table heard it for what it was. Then one of Dorian's longest-standing lieutenants, a man named Voss, who had been at his side since the beginning, stood up. He raised his glass. "To Ms. Vane," he said. "Not the bookkeeper. Not Cecilia, not the careful diminishment of a title that placed her at a comfortable distance. Ms. Vane. The full weight of it." The table stood. Dorian watched Cecilia, who was standing at the far end with a kitchen towel over her shoulder, looking at the room with an expression that she was not entirely succeeding, keep twos. He stood as well. "Ms. Vane," he said, in a voice that carried, "is not our bookkeeper." The table was quiet. "She is the reason this house functions. She is the reason the people in it function. She pays attention when the rest of us have stopped." He looked at her, and she was right. None of them are interchangeable. He didn't say anything else. He sat down. Cecilia looked at him across the length of the table, over all those people in the warm light of a kitchen that had become something it hadn't been before she arrived. She pressed her lips together. Then she nodded once, small and certain, the way she did when she meant it. She turned back to the stove. Dinner continued. The room was different than it had been when it started. Not louder, not more performatively cheerful, just settled in the way rooms become settled when the people inside them understand something together that they hadn't understood separately. Portia Hale would tell a mutual acquaintance that Cecilia Vane had been scheming from the start. The acquaintance had nodded politely and privately disagreed. People who schemed didn't remember what everyone had for dietary restrictions, didn't replace light bulbs that gave people headaches, didn't label leftovers with careful notes about how to reheat them gently. Cecilia had just been paying attention. That was, in the end, the thing that mattered most. The thing nobody had thought to notice, until they couldn't imagine the house without it. She hadn't taken anything. She had simply seen people, clearly and without agenda, and fed them when they were hungry. In a world that ran on leverage and consequence, that turned out to be the rarest thing of all.